So you guys realize that the thing that makes Western civilization different is big government, right? Defining Western civilization is a thorny problem. Everybody has their own theories, and sometimes even discussing the question can seem a little racist. So let's focus on a narrower question. Why was it the Europeans, specifically the British Empire, that were able to force the world into a single system under their control? Now, to generations before my own, the answer was probably blindingly obvious. The Europeans had stronger government. All the other plausible explanations, better technology, capitalism, etc., are downstream from government centralization. This is pretty obvious. But in the United States, after 40 years of the Reagan-Thatcher era, we really don't like this answer, so we do everything we can to avoid it. I'm a recovering libertarian myself, and it took me years of study to grasp this really basic point. The more world history I read, the more stunned I am by the sophistication, wealth, and power of all world civilizations prior to the 19th century. The more I read, the more ridiculous it seems that a few guys from a grim North Atlantic island were able to crush the empires of Genghis, Aurangzeb, the Yongle Emperor, and Fatih Sultan Mehmed. What it comes down to is power. European systems concentrated power in shocking new ways, while the rest of the world kept power split up and lost. Books like Janet Abu-Lughod's Before European Hegemony and Aisha Zerakol's Before the West show that the world was much more similar 800 years ago than it was 200 years ago. From the tip of the Iberian Peninsula through the Muslim lands, across Central Asia and India, power was much more distributed than it is today. Most regions of the world had a political power, whether it was a king, an emperor, or some kind of city-state republic. But the old stereotype of all-powerful Oriental despots is a myth. Brief, successful, centralized decades, rarely as much as a century, with a Genghis, an Aurangzeb, a Yongle Emperor, or a Fatih Sultan Mehmed, made a bigger impression on the historical record, but they weren't the norm, any more than Napoleon was. Most medieval rulers had little respect for individual rights, but they were massively limited by group rights. Religious life, and therefore social and family life in most societies, was governed by a separate set of sacred authorities that the political power had to defer to, or at least negotiate with. Commercial life, often looked down upon by the elites, was fairly planned and controlled. Not by government regulation, but by a dense thicket of agreements between guilds and other organized bodies of merchants and artisans that largely operated outside of government control and sometimes operated their own governments. It's important to emphasize that the foregoing description applies to medieval Europe, but it also applies to most of Asia and to what little we know about Africa as well. The rest of the world fell in the 1800s, because it stayed the same as it had been in preceding centuries, while the British and the European followers, also known as Western civilization, changed massively. Quick note, I am less sure about this analysis when it comes to China, which seems to have become more centralized much earlier. This may be why it managed to hold on to its independence into the 1860s. Much longer than almost anybody else. The first thing that folks usually come up with when talking about Western advantage is naval technology. First Spanish and Portuguese ships, and later Dutch and British ones, could blow most other things out of the water. But how do you think they got that way? Naval technology is military technology, first and foremost, paid for by governments. Portugal, the pioneer in European global reach, was able to send commercially oriented voyages further and further afield because princes like Henry the Navigator paid for it. There was no division between governmental and commercial power. Christopher Columbus had to spend years finding a royal government to pay for his expedition before he could go out and accidentally find the Americas. Starting in the 1500s, religion began to lose its battle with political power in Europe. England, under Henry VIII, was ahead of the pack here, insulting the Pope and appropriating the wealth of the monasteries. Henry was a uniquely loathsome individual, but he may be more responsible for eventual British dominance than anybody else. As European monarchs consolidated their power over religion, it only made sense to attack alternate sources of commercial power as well. From guilds to independent merchant-run city-states to peasant rights to common land, all economic power bases outside the central state were crushed. Napoleon finished the job of wiping out Europe's ancient laws and republics, but the process had been going on for centuries beforehand.
Quick note from the editing room. You may have found that description of early European development to be too quick or maybe even a little superficial. Well, have I got good news for you. The next 2 weeks of episodes on the podcast will be specifically about the relationship between Tudor England and the development of the modern world. You should check those out on Spotify, Amazon, or any of a number of other podcast platforms. Cool.
We often think of these revolutions in terms of individual freedom of religion and freedom of trade. And that's absolutely what they were. They were revolutions of individual freedoms, but they were also about government freedom from any of the traditional limits on its power. Government used individual rights to crush group rights. These new-style European states fought each other mercilessly for centuries, forcing each other into deeper levels of centralization and sophistication. In 1815, the British won against Napoleon and turned outward. The world didn't stand a chance. It's pretty straightforward. The victory of Europe or the West or Britain or Anglo-hegemony or whatever is fundamentally a story about building and using big government, which is pretty inconvenient for right-leaning folks in the United States who love to talk about Western civilization. So we've come up with a series of rationalizations. We here in the Reagan-Thatcher era are very invested in the idea that the British and Dutch empires represented some kind of free market alternative to the authoritarian Catholic Spanish and Portuguese approaches, but that's mostly bullshit. The capitalistic aspect of these systems that we are so impressed by are merely outgrowths of government power. The Dutch and British bested their Iberian rivals and everybody else by employing scrappier, more efficient forms of centralization. The Dutch Golden Age of the 1600s was certainly funded by financial innovation and rapacious capitalism, but these aspects we focus on are inseparable from the strength of Dutch government. The United Provinces were a nation of refugees, organized around their fanatical vision of Christianity. They figured out new ways to make money, but they did so in service to a state devoted to near-constant warfare. In the Reagan-Thatcher era, we hear a lot about the Dutch Republic's innovation with joint stock companies, and we hear almost nothing about the fact that they kind of invented the modern national debt and were pioneers in income tax as well. Britain's East India Company is even more deeply misunderstood. For the first century or so, Britain's biggest and most important colony, India, was run by the East India Company, a government body that also had some commercial priorities. It was nothing like a modern big business. I have fallen for this fallacy in the past as well. Here in the Reagan-Thatcher era, we love looking at the East India Company and pretending that it was big business that led the way and what was probably the most important example of European conquest. Because since the 1980s, the mantra in the English-speaking world has been business good, government bad. This is a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of the East India Company and even what a corporation was before the 19th century. The East India Company was not some freestanding institution like a medieval merchants guild or a modern defense contractor that serves its shareholders instead of the American people. The East India Company was a government-created monopoly. The point was to create large profits that allowed for expansion. When that monopoly was revoked in 1833, all commercial activities quickly ceased. But the East India Company had primarily been a government agency long before the end of their trade monopolies. Within a few decades of acquiring large Indian land holdings in the 1750s, the company became subject to more or less constant reordering of its governance and priorities by Parliament. And after the embarrassment of the First War of Indian Independence in the 1850s, the company was quickly swept away entirely. Now, I am a huge fan of capitalism, and in the right context, I like free markets too. But it's important to remember that these vital tools of human development are only possible and only remain viable through constant government intervention. There is no large-scale capitalism without strong government. As one example, have you tried to use a phone in the United States recently? They are no longer useful for their primary purpose, receiving phone calls. I get at least 4 junk phone calls a day, so I ignore all calls and nobody who isn't already in my phone can reach me. The U.S. government has pretty expansive rights over our airwaves and against fraud, but they are not allowed to use those rights by Congress currently because government is bad. Phones are just the most obvious example. Things are spinning out of control on a number of levels in this late Reagan era. To avoid chaos and save capitalism, the government needs to establish the ground rules and keep them refreshed by steady enforcement. We haven't really been doing that for the past 40 years. Government funding has been directly responsible for almost every innovation we currently credit to business. Manufacturing with standardized parts, the internet, and the research behind almost every single health innovation we celebrate were initially paid for by the U.S. government. That's the science funding that the Republicans have been trying so hard to cut recently. One of the most neglected duties of governments in recent decades is the breaking up of commercial monopolies that have gained too much power. Government cycles, like business cycles, are probably inevitable. Scandals like Watergate or the oil crisis can discredit government, just like the Great Depression discredited American business for a couple generations. In the 1970s, the anti-government switch made some sense, but if we don't eventually move back into an era of respect for government, we risk losing momentum as a country. I've become convinced that this momentum loss is what has been happening in the United States since the turn of the century. Greed has been causing crisis after crisis, but outsized wealth's corruption of government and our perverse respect for big business keeps delaying any correction. I worry that if the U.S. Republic continues on its current trajectory, we could lose our republic. And that could have apocalyptic, nuclear Napoleon-style results for the rest of the world as well. The thing is, I think deep down everybody knows that markets aren't the solution to everything the way we've been pretending they are for the past 40 years. This is why everybody, Republicans and Democrats, seems to be so in love with the military and are trying to use it to solve every government problem. We're lusting after big government. As just a single example, we have a really basic trade problem with China that could be quickly solved with a few laws. But that would be big government. So instead, Washington, D.C. is trying to start World War III with China over Taiwan. Under Reagan ideology, the military is the only government agency that's allowed to do anything, so everybody is putting all their hopes and expectations for the future on it. Unfortunately, all the military knows how to do is war, which is why we keep fighting, even though our last serious enemies were defeated most of a century ago. For the past 40 years, the U.S. has been so overwhelmingly powerful that our fantasies about the primacy of markets haven't really mattered. The rich have been able to do as they please without completely screwing up all the good things the U.S. has going. But it won't last. It never does. Consider China. They figured out the virtues of strong centralized government long before the West did. They were arguably the most impressive thing on the planet for thousands of years. Until they weren't. Like the U.S. today, from the 1500s or so, the Chinese were so secure that they got lazy. All the power and civilization that their strong government won became a plaything for corrupt elites. Over centuries, all that wealth was diverted further and further to a few classes that used the power to win more and more wealth. Because the wealth was wasted on corruption, China didn't do the things it should have done. Early modern China didn't sweep the Portuguese and the Dutch out of Asia, the way that the China of the early 1400s could have done without breaking a sweat. China's greedy elites allowed the majority of Chinese to get so poor and miserable that a communist revolution seemed like the only way forward. Over the past 40 years, I think the United States has fallen into a similar sort of tailspin. There are a lot of great people working hard to bring us out of it by breaking up some of these corporate monopolies or challenging the corrupt U.S. foreign policy elites that have brought us into catastrophe after catastrophe for their personal benefit and nobody else's. But I think it's a very open question whether or not we'll be able to correct course in time. To be clear, I'm not trying to say that U.S. empire wasn't founded in part by big businesses. What I'm saying is that those big businesses were impossible without the guidance of ruthlessly centralized government. We love to hide the ball on this. Monopoly critic Matt Stoller recently pointed out an example of our ongoing lying to ourselves. You may have seen the recent news that Tesla has reversed course and has done a deal with other car companies to allow them to use their electric charging stations. This is great for the energy transition and is seen as a good business decision by Tesla that helped the recent run-up in Tesla's stock price. But Tesla didn't want to open their network. Most of the news stories neglected to include the important background from 6 months ago that the U.S. government had forced Tesla to open up that charging network. If business is left alone to do whatever it wants, it will always prioritize its own interests over the interests of the country or the world. We should really stop pretending that this isn't the case. Now, I'm not saying that centralized governance is the best way to organize a society. In fact, I remain pretty convinced it is not. I think there is moral and spiritual power and beauty in what India has tried to do for the past 80 years. In a glorious mishmash of ancient folkways and modern politics, India has attempted to hold on to group rights in ways that are sometimes very malign, but also sometimes very positive. In some important ways, India has been the most democratic country on the planet for almost a century now. But has it worked? Under Narendra Modi and the BJP, many, including myself, have been disturbed by the way that European-style nationalist centralization seems to be on the march. Unfortunately, this distasteful centralization also seems to be leading to growing Indian power and economic success. Greater centralization tends to crush diversity and build monocultures. Sensible countries try to maintain a balance between centralization and democracy. Hopefully, in the decades to come, the world will build an order that allows for more self-determination for all individuals and all groups. As human beings, we are more than capable of accomplishing that noble aim. But the current fragmentation of the United States isn't leading to utopia. It's leading to war. Appalling little wars like the ones in the Middle East, and the growing chance of a wider, apocalyptic worldwide war. To avoid that war, I think we have to remember how important big government has been to worldwide development and what it could bring all of us in the future.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And have I mentioned recently that I have an email list? If I lose access to any of these platforms, it will be the only way for me to reach my audience. Please do sign up either at the link here or the link in the video description. Thanks.